So it looks like we are live on Facebook.
We are live on Facebook.
Welcome, welcome. So we are here in another heart-to-heart conversation. We are very happy and delighted to be here today. And these are different here. This is the beautiful team. We are different providers at Counseling of El Paso, and we will be opening up our hearts and opening it up to the community heart as well. So we want to thank you. Feel free to say hi if you want to check in. We will be sharing some resources at the end of the presentation as well. And thank you again for being here. My name is Jazmine Silva. I'm a licensed professional counselor here at Counseling of El Paso. And here we have Cristal.
Hello, everybody. Nice to see you all again. I'm Cristal Martinez Acosta. I'm a licensed professional counselor supervisor in the state of Texas, and I work with Counseling of El Paso.
Yay!
And then we have Guillermo.
My name is Guillermo Castañeda Sr. I'm a professional hypnotist in Counseling of El Paso. In Mexico, I'm a psychologist since 1968 and a hypnotist since 1979.
Okay, and my name is Guillermo Castañeda as well. I'm a licensed professional counselor here in the state of Texas, and I also work here at Counseling of El Paso.
Yay! All right. So we will go ahead and get started. Go ahead, Memo.
Well, I think one of the things we should talk about are the reasons why we're having the presentation. As you all know, on Monday, May 25th, George Floyd was assassinated in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Well, he was murdered. And as you know, there have been protests around the world as to why, against the racism. One of the things that we need to know is that over the year, the police have fatally shot more than 1,000 African Americans over in a year span, and they are only 13% of the population in the United States. Many of them have been shot in traffic stops, some while being outside and just enjoying jogging, some in their homes, and some, just holding a toy gun at a store. This is not a comfortable topic for many, but at Counseling of El Paso, we know that this is very important to talk about. It's very important to present the impact that discrimination and racism has on the mental health of the victims and also the community. It would be very easy to shy away from this topic, just to act as if it didn't exist, but that wouldn't change anything. I believe that education and speaking about something is actually a very useful tool to extinguish this disease. We know that this is going to impact many races, genders, nationalities, ages, disabilities, sexual orientations in the same way. But we're going to be honoring the African Americans who has suffered or lost their lives due to racism, including many Blacks that are also Latinos. And so this roundtable is dedicated to them. Black Lives Matter.
Yes.
Okay. When we talk about racism, about discrimination, we're talking at the beginning, they are based in the prejudice. Prejudice is a previous judgment. because you are judgmenting something previously. By example, when we see a person that is sweating, we think, oh, it's not a clean person. But we don't know if they was working or not. When we see some person resting during the day, we think, oh, he's lazy. And we don't know if he didn't sleep last night working, then we don't need to base our judgment just in the image of the person. We need to move to more about them. We need to have more information of a situation, more information of the persons.
Right. And like Guillermo is explaining, when it comes to prejudice, typically it comes when we're missing information. We don't have enough information. We're missing a lot of details. So there is a generalization and assumption made. And this is typically things that lead to stereotypes. But when it comes to discrimination, this is what becomes observable. This is an action, a behavior or a treatment. And it could be both based on implicit or explicit biases. So sometimes this form of discrimination may be it is visible whether we are aware of it or not. It's still discrimination. So this is where somebody is receiving either a treatment that is unjust or unfair to a group or an individual also. And it could also look like favoritism also to another individual. Providing a favor or a privilege because of that same discrimination or those prejudices that are underneath. So this is where we can see it, and it's very observable. This is an action.
And then we talk about this racism. And this is the belief that all members of any race possess specific characteristics or abilities for that race, especially in order to distinguish it as superior or inferior to another race or races. If we notice the Black people, they've suffered from racism since the beginning of this country, and even before, all throughout the world. But in this country, since it began, they were used as slaves in order to make this country happen, to work on this country. And even they've been even used as slaves in the modern era. But we'll talk about that later on. But it's from the start that they have been seen as inferior, and that has made a shock in the Black population.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and this takes us to the individual racism, because when we, the individual person, think about a race, about a person practicing his religion or something, we are thinking about what kind of persons are, by example, Black people. We are generalizing the characteristics of the persons, and we have some assumptions about that. By example, several things are about the Black people. We probably think they are very lazy, but that's not true, because each person is different. It doesn't matter the race, it doesn't matter nothing. each person is different, but we think about it and we spread these beliefs in our universe, little universe, our family, the persons that with we interact.
Mhm.
Yes, and to add on to what everybody else is saying, discrimination based on race and ethnicity takes many forms. Something that I think we have to understand about racism, individual racism, and systemic racism is that there's an element of oppression, especially of Black people, and especially in the United States, even though this is all around the world. The United States has made progress, in eliminating some of the legalized and institutionalized racial discrimination of past years, like Jim Crow laws, for example, but there are still many disparities between many people of color and white people, and especially Black people, including unemployment by African Americans. Latinos and Native Americans are also included, but African Americans also experience a considerably higher rate than the national average. There's income inequality, and Black-skinned people are disproportionately affected at all stages of the criminal justice system, like Memo was saying in the beginning, not only due to police violence, but in other areas of the justice system. And these are examples of all the effects of so many centuries of slavery and oppression that has resulted in inequality and injustices. And I think something else that I wanted to add to Jasmine's point was the implicit and explicit bias. I'm not sure if you had mentioned that already, Jasmine.
Mhm. Mhm.
Okay, yeah.
Being
so
aware of it or not, but feel free to elaborate more on it. Mhm.
I was just thinking about how if you have a preference of another race or a person of another color, it might not be that you're being acting maliciously or anything like that. It's just something that is like an unconscious type of preference. And I think Memo will talk about that a little bit later.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's
most
right.
definitely. And with the systemic racism, we also have to see that it also dictates where the Black people are going to be living at,
Mm.
and the neighborhoods that they're going to be living at, and the access to resources because of that. It's also dictating as they grow what kind of education they're going to get. It's also dictating what kind of jobs they're going to get, and from there, it just becomes a whole issue, because we also notice that with the systemic racism, we're talking about 1 in every 3 Black people. They're going to have issues with the system as far as being jailed or in prison. And this is, for example, for the white population, they're only going to be there each 1 in 17. So that definitely creates a very interesting disproportion of what's of how to show how the system is even racist against the people. When we talk about racism, we also have to talk about microaggressions. So these are manifestations of our prejudices. They can be insults, indignities, or degrading messages that are unconscious for the most part, and they do not have the purpose of hurting somebody, of malice, but they do have a very negative impact. For example, a person of another race that was born here, and the English might be the first language, they might be told that they speak very good English, or you know, a person can be told that they should play basketball very well because of their race. So what we notice about the microaggressions is that they're really not very pushy. We notice that they're very subtle, and so even the person receiving it, they might not understand that they're receiving it, even when feeling uncomfortable. And so when confronted, though, the person that actually said it, they are most often offended, because it's like, well, I didn't want to say that. I didn't say that. But we notice that it is very hurtful for people that receive it in a in social gatherings, or maybe in the education system, or maybe at work. And for the most part, it masks some type of conscious or unconscious discrimination or racism that may exist.
Mhm. Yes, absolutely. It's similar to implicit bias, right? In
Right.
that way.
Exactly.
Yes. So to also add on to that, we have to also consider that after a Black person has experienced I guess a collective or a collected experience of aggression, violence, microaggressions, oppression that goes back 400 plus years, injustice, unfairness. This is going to result in some feelings, and this is going to result in some. I don't want to call them symptoms, but they are signs and signals that our bodies and minds let us know that something is wrong. And it can result in trauma, which is what we would call racial trauma. So this type of collective racism has resulted in oppression that still exists, even though we're in 2020. And it's very obvious based on why we're even talking about this topic, and why we decided to do this presentation, because of George Floyd and all of the other Black people that were unjustly killed and murdered. And so we also know that because of the history that Black people have in the United States being oppressed, everything is so much harder for them and for people of color, but especially for African Americans and even Afro Latinos, anybody that's Black skinned, because they are judged based on the color of their skin. And even if it's implicit or covert or a microaggression, these things affect their opportunities, and they become barriers between them and actual equality or equity. So I would imagine that they're tired of being oppressed and for fighting so much for basic rights, opportunities in life. And so all of these microaggressions, violence, inequality, all these experiences cause fatigue. It can cause feelings of fear, feelings of being in danger, feeling sad, feeling disappointed, feeling angry, feeling defeated. And feeling this way for such a large amount of time, for your whole life plus generations back, can contribute to racial trauma.
That's right. And like Crystal was explaining about the different feelings that we have, one of the things, we can experience feelings of sadness, rage, frustration, anger. One of the feelings that can that can occur, that can be felt, is a feeling of an emotion and a feeling of shame that can come. It's a side effect that comes from experiencing racism. So what happens with shame, it is felt in the core, in our center, but it comes from a place of like receiving constant messages. Not that it's not based on any validity, but that's what happens when we are continuously receiving these external messages, or treatment, or actions. And it starts to develop internalized beliefs. It starts creating a dialogue inside of us that either we're not good enough, that we are not worthy. And those are really, that is the mental health impact that it has on, and also how complex it can be. So one of the things that it can lead to is also like racial trauma, but also complex trauma, because whenever trauma occurs, it doesn't occur in isolation. It's not just one thing that is isolated. There's other variables that in layers that connect to it. So one of the things that can hurt is silence. Whenever we experience shame and we're feeling it, or we're witnessing it, the silence hurts. And if anything, what can really hurt is when we are trying to silence someone else. When individuals who have experienced racism, they need to tell their story. They need to speak up, and silencing is not what helps. In fact, it hurts and it perpetuates pain to a wound that's already opened. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And everything we said has an impact in our behavior, have an impact in our emotions. It can explain about posterior behaviors. By example, when we feel this kind of emotions, the answer of our organism is based in our primitive brain. We act like defensively. We act aggressively also. It can explain some of the behaviors of the multitude. It can explain several things because we are acting in primitive way. Then our aggressivity can be active or inactive. Active when we show some kind of acts, hitting, yelling, and several more things. And passive when we don't act, when we are seeing some person or persons with difficulties, and we are passive. Then this is very important to understand the actual situation.
True.
That's right. And like Guillermo was explaining, there are defense mechanisms that are developed out of place of protection. And something that occurs too whenever we experience traumatic experiences, in this case, racial trauma, either we become aware of it, experienced it, loved ones experienced it. It's a common side effect or a common defense mechanism that occurs is hypervigilance and hyperawareness. So what happens is that we become aware of something that other individuals might not be aware of. So symbols that or symbols basically that other individuals might not be triggered by it or might not be afraid of or concerned about, that's what hypervigilance does. It looks for cues, it looks for symbols that might represent a sense of a source of danger to them. So hypervigilance is like making sure if, like, for example, if somebody is pulled over and they're checking that they have their wallet somewhere visible and they do want to make sure their hands are on the steering wheel. Those are things that it creates a hyper awareness because we become aware that a symbol for somebody else, typically, you know, a police officer is typically a source of protection. For a minority or a person of color, it might not. So that's something that we want to explain, that that is a sense of that's what occurs whenever we have experienced a form of racial trauma as well. Mm-hmm.
And to add a little bit to that, when we are hyper aware or hyper vigilant, it creates this feeling of stress a lot of the times, and that can even bring other health related issues, physically health related issues. So then we have to talk about also the impotence of the people, their helplessness and their hopelessness. It's they've been speaking about it ever since about 400 years ago. They've been saying, we don't want this, please change it. And it does create a sense of impotence when people don't listen. As Jazmine was saying, when people actually tell you how you're supposed to speak, don't protest this way, don't kneel down, don't be angry, don't come out and use those words. You're supposed to do a peaceful protest, but not that way.
Or you cannot speak.
You cannot speak. So everything creates that. And when we also notice that the systemic racism is out there, and they've been speaking about it, and they've been talking about it, and that doesn't change, well, that is going to create that helplessness. And with the hopelessness, the helplessness, and the impotence, we also notice that a lot of people can actually fall into depression. So, you know, and the aggressiveness that we were talking about. So how am I going to externalize this? I'm going to externalize this maybe against others, or maybe against myself. And it's really important to understand that many of these people that are going through this desperation, this hopelessness, they even commit suicide. So this is what racism, this is what discrimination does. It's very dangerous. It's a very dangerous disease.
Right. And, you know, as we address these different concepts and different concepts, we don't want to tell anybody how to feel or how what to do with the pain. But what we want to do is, as we become aware of the injustice that has occurred as a community, as individuals, we want to address some things that we can do at our level to be able to better understand this as well.
Yeah, so one of the things that we need to be aware of is of the privilege that we may have. And just notice that not everybody begins life in the same way. I gave an example before of how maybe I'm watching a football game. But let's say that I'm watching the football game and all of a sudden my team, you know, before the game even starts, they're already winning 21-0. And then I'm saying like, okay, well, you know, your team must catch up. It's fair because it's my team that's winning it. And that's what privilege is. we notice that we're not, when we have privilege, we notice that we don't have any, we're not victims in life because of a race or color. So it's very difficult to empathize with the people that do receive those attacks because I have not lived it. And we can say something like, hey, please just, I don't understand why you can't just make it. If you put your effort, you can do it. What they tell us about the American dream, for example. Everybody has the opportunity to make it. And that's not true. We know that the system is not allowing people to actually excel as easily as other people with a privilege. For example, if somebody's raised in a home where the parents are not college educated and they're maybe earning the minimum wage, and then the child has to grow up and in that environment, and then maybe work for the minimum wage to help the family. And so how is the child, or how is the family supposed to save for college when they don't even have enough and they're barely making it to feed the family? And then we have some people that said, well, you know what? I came from poverty. I did it. It's okay. You can make it as well. But, understand that maybe that person went to college because of a scholarship. Well, that the Black person should have done it too. Yeah, but we notice that the scholarships, whenever you apply, their name doesn't sound like yours. And so right away, it already has that bias against them.
Yeah, that's systemic racism.
Systemic racism. And then, or maybe it was easier that they were accepted, because they studied at the right school. And maybe the school with the lower socioeconomic status, maybe it doesn't carry the name that the other one does. Or maybe you have better grades because you had access to laptops or resources, tutors, books, I don't know. And then, we notice that makes a privilege. And this is not to go against the person that has the privilege, because they didn't ask for this. Nobody signs up to have privilege. But I think that it's important to notice, just notice it and understand that nobody's against you because of that. It is not a sin to have privilege. Just acknowledge it so that you can empathize with those that don't have the privilege that you do.
Yes, absolutely. I think you bring up a good point about reflection. So reflecting upon our own privilege, reflecting upon white privilege specifically, and then also really thinking about your biases, your implicit biases. So even though, for example, like I'm a person of color, I may have an implicit bias to prefer somebody of lighter skin if I'm maybe going to go to the grocery store or talk to a stranger or something, or ask somebody for help. So those are the types of things that perpetuate racism and systemic racism. And so if you are reflecting upon your privilege, also understand how you can use your privilege to become an ally, and a true ally, understanding that as specifically like a white person, if you have white privilege and using that privilege to lift up people of color and giving up your positions of power to allow Black people specifically to take those positions, because we know that there's already so many cards stacked against them, that there really is no true equity until we have white allies and until all Black lives really do matter. I think the other thing that we need to think about is understand how we're perpetuating racism, especially including Latinx people, because I think we put ourselves in like, oh, we're people of color too, so it's not possible for us to be racist. But yes, there are racist Latinx people, and I think it's important to call that out in our community. And we also want to reflect on what type of energy and privilege we can give to the fight against racism. And then personally asking ourselves, how am I hurting Black people with either microaggressions, with my words, with my inaction?
Very good. Mm-hmm.
It's very important to understand, because one of the conclusions is we need to hear the history of the persons. We need to hear, we need to know more about it. We need to act without prejudice. This is the mainly thing. It's very important to say, when one person, when one country doesn't know its history, it's condemned to make the same mistakes eternally, for eternity. This is very important to understand. Then we need to know more about it to norm our criterion. This is very, very important as a conclusion for my part.
Yes, that's right. And I think that I want to also like highlight how important it is to listen. Let's say we did talk a little bit about some defensiveness or some defense mechanisms that might occur, whether we're aware of it or not. And I think there's so much power in being able to reflect and look inward, which may be uncomfortable for some of us. But listening to someone's pain, seeing them, understanding them, I think that is also very important and crucial whenever we hear somebody's narrative, because you might be hearing a traumatic, a racial narrative that is being that they have been carrying, and it might not be just this present story like what we're seeing right now. We're looking at a transgenerational history. This is the narrative, this is the story, this is the pain, the real hurt and pain that the individual is carrying. So I think being able to listen and understand can really provide context, be able to understand, in this present moment, we're seeing this going on, but this is everything that's really behind it. It really actually helps us be able to understand, empathize, and really make contact with compassion.
And there's, history does have a tendency to repeat itself. And so it's important to listen to the previous generations, previous situations where racism existed or any other kind of discrimination existed. And there's a poem by a German pastor. The name is Martin Niemöller. And that says, first, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. I think that one of the things that is most important is to speak out. It's okay to not be racist, but now we need to be anti-racist. We need to speak for others who at this moment are not able to speak out for themselves.
Yep.
Use your voice.
Were you going to add something, Crystal, after I finished my part? Yeah.
I just want to say that's a really great poem. It's so powerful. And I think that everything that each one of us have talked about are really what we call trauma-informed care principles. Because if you are not anti-racist and you are not doing racial inclusivity work, then you are not trauma informed. So I really believe that as a therapist, and this is just my professional and personal opinion about therapy and, you know, the people I work with right now, my colleagues that you see on the screen, I really truly believe that to be trauma informed, you have to be anti-racist and really understand where your biases come from and where like you said, Memo, right now with the poem, like being able to speak up for people who cannot speak for themselves right now or who don't have privilege. And honoring history, like you said, Jasmine, and understanding that this is the whole history behind a person. Really being able to listen, being transparent, and being able to listen with empathy and understanding. I think that that's really, truly what encompasses like trauma sensitivity and trauma informed care. I just say that because that's my background and I was heavily trained in that. And so I feel like these two topics go so well together, and they have to coexist together in order for each of them to exist. So that's all I wanted to add.
Oh, that's very beautiful, Crystal. Thank you so much, and we want to thank you for opening up your hearts to our counseling hearts as well. I want to thank Cristal Martinez Acosta, Guillermo Castañeda Sr., and Guillermo Castañeda Jr., also known as Memo. And we really, really, truly want to thank you so much. I think we should probably do a check-in and see if there are any comments or anything like that, or questions.
We do.
Okay, awesome.
We have, well, first of all, hello to everyone
Hi, hello.
And there's a comment list. Hello, everyone. Great topic of discussion. As a social anthropologist, I'll give my perspective in a few words. There is no such thing as an official concept of different human races. Humanity is a race, and as a race, we are comprised of different ethnicities. It is imperative to start educating new generations about the structural and anthropological concept of being human. If we could start doing that since early ages, elementary and on, we will eliminate discrimination in a matter of a generation and a half. Also, along with it, we should push the sheer idea of making discrimination a healthcare problem. People who discriminate have a dysfunctional process of thinking because their thinking process has been ruined by culturally deformed concepts as it happened throughout history. Those who discriminate should be identified as soon as possible so that they can be treated. I think I think that's a very good point. It is a very good point. And it's okay, and this is where it could be a little bit dangerous when we talk about that. I do agree very much that it is a human race, but many people use that and saying, you know what, we are all one, and they go through a concept, for example, all lives matter, and while they do, we tend to put aside the message of, for example, the Black people. And so while, yes, we are a human race, and while there are different ethnicities and colors of skin, you know, everybody is different, and we should accept those differences and tolerate those differences. That's what makes it important. I agree with Marcelo in what he said. It is discrimination is a disease, and I think that people should be treated as soon as possible when we find out that they do have it.
Right.
That's right. Mhm.
Go
I
ahead.
was also thinking about how I agree that there are different theories about the origins of like humanity, and maybe there's different categories for different humans and ethnicities and everything. But I think the danger with that is that if we don't call racism out for what it is and teach other generations, this is what racism looks like, this is what discrimination looks like, and we don't clearly define that, then what we're doing is that we're kind of erasing that part of human history. And although that sounds good, like, oh, let's erase the fact that racism ever happened, I think that that can really do a huge injustice, not only to Black people, and people of color, but it can also, I feel, really hurt their feelings about it, and cause more trauma. So that's what I think about that. I think we need to call it what it is and teach future generations. And like earlier, Guillermo Sr. did say, like, if we don't review our history, then we're going to repeat it. So I think there is a place for what you're saying in the comment, but I think that you do have to have like a comprehensive education of race and history, and not just do cherry picking of either side, either history or anthropology or whatever it is. And it has to be comprehensive so that we honor that past.
Yes, most definitely. One of the things that I think I would like to add about, you know, the racism and the way that it's been playing a part is that also as healthcare providers, we do need to realize who we are and what we have. I think that Crystal mentioned in the Spanish presentation that we had some resources, and we're going to be sharing those resources about anti-racism for social workers and counselors. It's important to understand where we're sitting, and because we're going to have everybody in front of us, and we need to know their history in order to be able to speak to them. So we will share those resources. We will share other resources that are important. For example, the 13th, which talks about the 13th Amendment, and that, you know, it's a documentary on Netflix, and other documentaries about Black Lives Matter. So we understand where they're really coming from.
Right.
And also, I'd like to say something more. We have a very big responsibility as adults. The big responsibility is to teach our children to be different than us, different, looking for a better world.
Yes.
Right. And I think that's where also the comment was heading towards, like being able to make contact with that humanity part of us. And I think that when we disconnect and dehumanize another human being, I think that is very, very very dangerous. So staying in touch with the human part of us, staying humane, I think is an important aspect when we're teaching little ones since they're little.
Right. No, nobody is less than, nobody is more than. We're just different.
Yeah, so again, thank you so much. And we will be updating those resources in the comments below. And again, thank you again. And we will be here. We will be sharing some resources too, for in case anybody wants to get in touch with a mental health provider or anything like that.
Most definitely. And thank you very much, everybody, for showing up. And we'll see you soon.
All righty. Thank you so much. Bye, guys. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.